Hello everyone, Sandrak here. So my last tier list video did quite well, so I'm back with another one. The main difference between that one and this one is oriented towards new beginners, new players or beginners that are before AR45 to sort of help them to get a grasp of which characters you can build in the early game and which characters you can build in the early game, but you have to get rid of in the late game. So with that said, this is more of an experimental form of content because these are oriented towards new players. If you are a player past AR45, feel free to leave your own thoughts down below in the comment section as well to help out the new players. And also, if you're a new player and you have any questions, please leave it in the comments down below. I'll try my best to answer. And if I do not happen to catch all the questions, I'm sure there will be people in the comment section that will be able to answer your question. So with that said, let's get started. A few things to note for this tier list. First, I'm not ranking characters within the same tier as the one that's put before the other one is better. So for example, if Venti and Mona both goes in the solid in late game tier list, and I put Venti before Mona, it doesn't mean that Venti is better than Mona, it just means I agree that both of them goes in the solid in late game tier list. Just so would that make that clear, because I don't think I was too clear on that in the last tier list, and a lot of people were commenting that this character should go higher than the other character, and that character should go higher than this character. It's a bit hard for me to basically go down to that much detail, so I'm just going to roughly lay out the different categories that character fits in. And the second one to note is that for all beginners out there, Inazuma characters, you cannot get their essential materials past AR 30 until you get to AR 30 or 35. I forgot exactly when, but when you unlock Inazuma, that's when you can get their essential materials. So with that said, if you have Inazuma character, you cannot bring them past AR 40 before you unlock Inazuma. So with that said, basically do proceed to building Inazuma characters with caution. Unless you are one of those characters that want to glitch through the entire ocean to get to Inazuma, in which case, good luck. But other than that, for everyone else, do be cautious to when you are getting Inazuma characters, that you probably won't be able to use them until you are sort of past the early game, sort of into the mid game, where you're at the AR 30 to AR 45 range. So with that said, let's get started. I'll try to go as fast as possible, only giving a few comments for each characters. So Fischl, her actual name is Amy, appears in less meta teams right now. Her only meta team is Taser team at the moment, and she's basically used as a battery for Beidou. But for early game characters, she's definitely good to use. She can be basically used as a universal battery for the early game, and also can actually do significant damage if you're in the early game. And she can be, she's basically a character that you can use sort of all the way until AR 50, AR 55ish until you have Raiden Shogun or like a better option. That's when you can swap her out. Venti, definitely someone you can build in the early game. Venti and Zhongli are the two best to use in the early game as of right now. But once Venti enters Inazuma, he is basically getting butchered because all the enemies, he basically cannot take advantage of any of them. So he is basically very good for early game characters. He still fits in the Spiral Abyss where there's a large group of enemies, he can go in there. But other than that, Venti isn't used too much, but I would highly recommend early game characters getting him. But when his next raid up comes up and you're already past the Liu and Mondstadt region into the Inazuma region, then I would consider wait a bit and not pull for him very fast. Mona is one of the standard five five-star characters in the standard banner. Mona's only team right now is Morgana, where she is the mo part of the Morgana. She is used to basically apply Hydro to freeze enemies. Her E is able to taunt enemies, and her Q is able to buff the damage of whoever is attacking next. For early game, Mona actually doesn't turn out to be too good because you sort of can only build her as more of a sub DPS than a damage buffer in the early game, but she'll be very useful in the late game. So if you have Mona, I wouldn't recommend building her exactly right away. But she is someone, if you want to use her, you can use as a sub DPS in the early game. Diona, one of the most versatile characters and definitely one of the most underrated characters in Genshin right now. The reason I would put her under basically the S tier, which is solid in late game tier, is because she is used in Morgana team, and as the only person who can generate shields in the Cryo or Hydro element, she is basically the only shielder you can use in the Morgana or Permafreeze comp. And furthermore, she is very good for beginners. She can use as a crowd battery. Her shield is not as strong as Zhongli's, but you can build them to be quite tanky. And she can also heal, so she is basically the more friendly version of Bennett for open world explorations, because you don't need Bennett sort of in the open world explorations. And she's definitely a fun character to play with, and she's also a very easy character to build. Bennett, also definitely one of the characters in the solid late game tier, because he is basically the god for Spiral Beast as of the moment. However, I only recommend using him in Spiral Beast past C1. If you have a C0 Bennett, Spiral Beast will be a little bit more painful to use. Bennett doesn't appear in banners often. I think he's only rated up 3 times so far in the entire game's history, so do make sure to snatch him when you see him rate up next. Personally, I got mine mostly through actually non-rate up banners or standard banners. That's how I got most of my copies. And for early game, again, Bennett is someone who doesn't work as well as Diona in the early game, but he's definitely someone you need to build for late game. Ganyu is someone you can definitely build for late game. Ganyu's main disadvantage is that she focuses on charge attack, which means she's not very friendly to mobile users. But other than that, Ganyu's Q, her E is for taunting, which is very good. Her Q does massive damage, and also her charge attack is also basically a nuclear bomb. So Ganyu is someone you can definitely use and will basically carry you all the way through, all the way into late game, and still be usable in the late game. Childe is someone I wouldn't build exactly. Childe is someone I wouldn't build exactly, but Childe is someone that is no longer in popular teams in the Spiral Beast. He appears in 2 variations of less meta team. One is Childe's Vaporize team, where you use him to do Vaporize, which is Hydro plus Pyro to do massive damage, but it's basically a nuclear team where you do one hit of big damage. And the other team he focuses in is Taser team, which again goes in with Fischl, so Hydro plus Electro to generate massive chain lightning damage. Childe is basically his 2 initial team right now, but for early game, Childe can use as a main DPS very easily because his damage is enough to carry you through early game. Sucrose is someone I would definitely recommend building for the mid to late game, but the main problem with Sucrose is she works well with Elemental Mastery, and you don't tend to want to grind for artifacts until you get to late game. So Sucrose is someone I would sort of use as a crowd control character in the early game, but once you transition to the late game, build a full Elemental Mastery Viridescent Veneer set on her, and she is going to basically carry you by buffing all your elemental reaction damage by quite a bit. Moving on to Yoimiya. Yoimiya is someone I would definitely say is on the less popular side for meta, but she is a still solid DPS. Her main 2 problem for beginners is 1, she has no AoE capability, so she's very good single target specialist, but for AoE you need to pair her with someone like Venti or someone that can gather enemies together so she can deal with them better. The other problem with, again, Yoimiya is an Inazuma character, so you have to wait for Inazuma to come out before you can fully build her. Moving on to Albedo. Albedo appears in less popular meta teams right now. He has generally 3 purpose as of right now. His E can generate shields, which his E can cause crystallized reactions, which she can generate shields. So if you do not have a designated shielding character, he can generate all the shields for you. The shields are definitely not as strong as the designated shielding character, but his shields are enough to carry you. His second option is his E can also do damage, which is enough for coordinated damage. And his third one is, I believe, his Q can buff the entire team's elemental mastery, so you can sort of work as a pseudo Sucrose for a bit. The main problem for Albedo is the fact that his crystallized reaction can mess up with other reactions in game and cause the wrong order of reactions to happen, or just completely miss elemental reactions. But the good thing for him is that you don't really care about that in the early game. So he's definitely a very solid utilized sub DPS in the early game. But just know that when you get him to late game, he doesn't fit into too many teams. But he does specialize very well in mono geo or teams that doesn't care about reactions. Jin is the character to build for early game. Early game to mid game, Jin can work as a main DPS or sub DPS or healer, or she can even work as all 3 at the same time. His E offers crowd control abilities, his Q offers the ability to not only heal but also removes all debuffs, and on top her damage is not bad. For early game Jin, I would recommend 2-piece physical, 2-piece anemo, or even 4-piece physical if you want to go all ham on the physical side of things. But do know that as she transitions into late game, she turns to be more of a character that fits as a substitute for if you do not have the healer. If you do not have like a better healer like Kokomi or Bennett or Diona, she can work in those teams as a substitute healer. So she doesn't get used a lot in late game, but she's very good in the early game. Moving on to Ayaka. Ayaka is basically the cryo meta right now. She is basically the single character that is carrying the entire permaphase team. But again, main problem for Ayaka, she's an Inazuma character. Can't really build her until you get to Inazuma. But on the plus side, she is very friendly to build, and her damage can be very significant even if you have a free-to-play build. Xiangling is a 4-star you are guaranteed to get after clearing a third floor of the Spiral Abyss, and she is someone you can basically count on after C4 to be basically the character to use in Spiral Abyss. She is one of the strongest 3-4 stars in Spiral Abyss right now, and her usage rate sometimes even overpowers a lot of 5 stars. So she is someone I would definitely recommend building, and for Xiangling, it's honestly pretty easy to build her early game. Just make sure she has enough attack and she has enough elemental mastery. That's all you need in the early game. As you transition to late game, do make sure to focus on her energy recharge and crit rate, crit damage a bit more. But general Xiangling is a character that can go on multiple different builds, and they all turns out to do around the same damage. She's a very good character, and she's someone you can basically start using from day one. Hu Tao is the meta for Pyro DPS right now. She is the strongest Pyro DPS, definitely someone I would recommend polling for. The main problem for Hu Tao is you need to learn HP control, because her E does take away 30% of her HP in order to boost damage. And on top, Hu Tao requires you to bring a Hydra character to cause vaporized reactions, most likely Xingqiu. And also Hu Tao requires a healer for the rest member of your team. She might not the healing herself because her Q heals herself, but the rest of your team will need a healer. And most of the time she's also used with Zhongli to provide the shields. So Hu Tao is someone I would definitely recommend building starting from day one. But Hu Tao is someone you need to learn a bit of her mechanic before you can get her to play very well. Beidou is definitely one of the solid starter characters to build. Beidou appears again alongside Fischl in Taser teams with Childe and Sucrose. However, the main problem for Beidou right now is her energy recharge problem, which she does need 80 energy to cast her Q. But Fischl is in the team basically to give Beidou all the energy. As for early game, Beidou works solid as a DPS to sub DPS depending on how you like playing her, and her parry mechanic is very fun especially if you can time it perfectly. Moving on to Qiqi. Qiqi is someone who is solid to use in until AR45. The only meta team Qiqi appears right now is the healer for Eula in the physical DPS team, but physical is not the meta right now, so Qiqi is not the meta. The other problem with Qiqi is Qiqi's energy particle generation is a problem for herself. Not to say that sometimes she even has to barry for other people, so it creates more of a problem. But Qiqi is solid as a healer for early game, and Qiqi is definitely the better option to substitute someone like Barbara for the early game. And personally, I didn't even get her until like a month ago, so I cannot recommend how to build her or anything like that in the early game. Keqing is someone I wouldn't recommend going past AR45 with. The main problem is Keqing is an old character like Diluc, like sorry, I forgot who else is in 1.0, but Keqing is an old character and basically cannot be used in terms of meta teams anymore. But as of a beginner character, Keqing is a solid DPS to carry you to AR45. Her damage isn't significant, but if you play her well, she's able to basically carry through most fights up to AR45. Moving on to Ningguang. If you have her C2, I would recommend building her as a solid DPS until AR45. If you do not have her C2, I do not recommend building her. The main thing for Ningguang is back in 1.0, she is basically the meta because she is a Geo element. Geo causes only crystallized reactions. So unless you're hitting Geo slimes, she can do significant damage to anyone because she doesn't care about elemental reactions at all. But as of right now, she is only good before 45 because afterwards, enemies' HP scaling becomes too much for her damage to handle. Diluc is someone who is solid until AR45. He was basically the meta before 1.0 until Klee power crept him over. But other than that, Diluc basically cannot offer you much in terms of meta team as of the moment. So again, solid starter, but cannot build past AR45. Razor, I wouldn't build if you have any of Keqing, Ningguang, and Diluc to build. Razor, the main problem with him is he has no usage at all in the late game. So any resource you sort of pour him into the early game is sort of wasted in the period of time where desperately trying to get two teams to work in Spiral Abyss. He can be playing the Spiral Abyss, of course, and Razor Mains out there can tell you his upper ceiling is quite high. But the problem with him is that the investment needed to touch the upper ceiling is also quite high. So it's not worth it from most people's standpoint of view to build Razor past the early game. Noelle, if you have her before C6, I do not recommend building her too much. However, if you have her after C6, she's basically the hyper carry that you can use all the way until probably R50 or even higher. The main problem with Noelle is she has to be on the field for her to heal and also generate particles and things like that. So if you use her as a healer, you basically have to give her shield time, field time, which means you also have to build her damage. Moving on to Chongyun. Chongyun is a solid sub DPS 2 DPS for the early game. Chongyun is still used a bit in the Spiral Abyss for the late game, but the only purpose for Chongyun as of right now is to generate to pop basically electro shields when there's too many electro characters. So solid to build in the early game, but I wouldn't recommend building if you have some of the better crowd sub DPS like Rosaria that can carry you to the late game. Chongyun isn't used in the late game too much right now, and even if he's used, he's more used as like a level 60 to level 1 even sometimes. Qiqi is very good for the early game. She's basically a pyro character but can also do geo reactions on her own. But again, Qiqi has sort of fallen off the meta, so I wouldn't recommend pulling her if you want a pyro DPS for the late game. But she's definitely good for the early game. Traveler is someone you can use in the early game, but I would definitely recommend swapping out as soon as you have better characters. All three travelers, like all travelers of 3 different elements, they are all sort of tutorial characters for the relative element. So they're all very fun to use, but they don't offer much in terms of damage or utility. Kaya now works mostly as a battery for cryo, but there's also much better options in terms of cryo battery. So you can use Kaya for the early game, but as soon as you have another character, cryo character, it's much easier to just swap out Kaya. Lisa, I wouldn't recommend building at all. The main problem is Lisa is sort of the tutorial character for Electro, and on top Lisa has a very complicated kit actually, so you need to read extensively before you'll know how to use her. And finally, Lisa's elemental burst costs 80, which is quite huge, and you pretty much have to pair her with an NRC Electro Barry, but that Electro Barry will probably perform better without Lisa, so overall she's not worth building at all. Moving on to Amber. Amber is someone I wouldn't recommend building at all. Again, she's a tutorial character, and she's basically been power crept countless times already. Barbara is someone I would recommend building until you have another healer. Barbara is a solid healer, but her only drawback and her most major drawback, which kills her pretty much in any competitive format, is because she applies Hydro onto herself when she's healing, and she also applies Hydro onto your active character. So if any of the enemies are cryo on the she's basically getting frozen all the time. So she is a very solid character in terms of the healing she can do in the early game. But do swap to like someone even Qiqi as soon as you have another character that can heal but doesn't apply you with Hydro all the time. Alloy is no longer obtainable as of 2.7, so I don't have much to say for her, and I mean also she's technically a 4-star in terms of power level and she has no constellations, so don't recommend building at all. Xiao appears in less popular teams as of right now. The main thing for Xiao is that Xiao has a very expensive team. The most popular team for Xiao right now is Xiao, Zhongli, Albedo, and Jin. All 4 are 5-star characters, so I wouldn't recommend building him. But if you have him in the early game, he's very good, moving around and things like that, and his damage is definitely significant. But like Hu Tao, with Xiao, you need to learn HP control, and you have to bring a healer on your team. So that's his main drawback, and his damage, as of right now, isn't enough to overpower some of the better DPS in the Spiral Abyss right now. Moving on to Shikanori Heizou, his isn't released right now, so I can't talk much about him. We also don't know any damage about him. I mean, like, some of the leaks do talk about the damage numbers, but you can't really tell how good the character is until you definitely get to play with them and pair them with different teams. Same case with Kuki Shinobu. She's gonna get released in 2 days, but as of this video, she's not someone that you can basically be playing right now, so I'm not gonna talk too much about her. And since I picked Lumi as my character for the Traveler, so Ether cannot be obtained for me, so also no talk for Ether as well. Xingqiu is someone in the S tier for sure. Xingqiu is basically the hydro application person right now, other than Yelan. And Xingqiu is someone you can easily get constellations of. He used to raid up quite often. I think they still do that. Hopefully his next raid up time comes soon. And Xingqiu is someone who can also offer you a bit of healing, a bit of damage absorption, and insane sub DPS. So Xingqiu is someone I would definitely recommend starting building from day one. I know most people don't like his luck, but if you look past his looks, he's a very strong character. Xinyan is someone I wouldn't recommend building. She's basically never meta ever since her release in 1.1, so probably don't waste time on her. I won't even go into too much into her kit. Zhongli is someone I would definitely recommend picking up as soon as possible. The main thing for Zhongli is his shield is basically unbreakable in the early game. So with his shield on, you can basically attack with no results of getting knockbacks or things like that. And sometimes you can even argue with Zhongli, you don't even need a healer on your team. So he's definitely someone you can definitely use in the early game quite a bit. And as of the late game right now, he's mostly working as a single shielder for Hu Tao, or someone that needs shielding, like Hu Tao and Xiao both sort of needs Zhongli to be able to do competitively. So with that said, he is definitely someone I would recommend start building from day one, and he's definitely someone that can carry you all the way to the late game. Rosaria is basically the better version of Kaya and also the newer Cryo Battery, and Rosaria herself can work as a solid physical or Cryo main DPS or sub DPS for beginners. I won't talk too much about her kit, but again, she is basically someone you can build on early on. And she also got nerfed twice already, not actually for her skills, but her breast size got nerfed twice already, so I would say she's a bit more kids friendly as of right now. Eula is someone I wouldn't recommend building in the late game, but Eula is someone who definitely has big damage because she basically has the highest damage multiples for a single skill for her Q, so you can basically one-shot enemies in the early game. But since physical is not the meta right now, Eula isn't too popular in the late game, but she's someone you can even use in the late game. Even if she's less popular, you can still use her in Spiral Abyss. Yanfei is probably one of the best 4-star DPS for beginners, but again, given that she's a 4-star DPS, she can be used in the late game just because not enough damage. But she is basically the Catalyst user with the best animation skill. It's very smooth, and on top, because she is Pyro and her constellations are sort of easy to get, she is one of the best. I would say if you don't have any 5-star DPS to start with, she is the character to build in terms of 4-star DPS. Kazuha is basically the peak of Spiral Abyss right now. Definitely recommend build starting from day one. He's gonna buff up your entire team's damage and also gas new enemies altogether. So definitely recommend start building from day one, and we'll see how he performs once Dendro comes out. But as of right now, he is the peak of Spiral Abyss right now and pretty much a 6-star character, if that makes sense. Sayu is someone I wouldn't recommend building if you have better healers, but if you do not have any healers and Barbara is your only healer and Sayu is also a healer you've got, Sayu can probably work a little bit better than Barbara because she won't apply Hydro on you. But other than that, Sayu is like a miniaturized version of Jean, but harder to trigger certain things. So I wouldn't recommend building her too much unless like she is the only healer other than Barbara that you have. Raiden Shogun is definitely solid in late game as of right now, both if you use her as a battery for certain characters like Yae Miko or Eula, or if you just use her as the burst DPS in the Raiden national team, she is popular. Again, she's an Inazuma character, so that's the drawback, but other than that, she basically has no drawbacks, and her artifacts domain is one of the best artifact domains, relatively speaking, in value right now, so she's definitely someone I would recommend pulling for 100%. As for Sarah, Sarah is the designated support for Raiden Shogun. She appears in less popular teams. I wouldn't recommend building her at all, actually, because unless you have C2 Raiden or things like that, unless you have a significant constellation numbers on Sarah, namely C2, her damage to buff Raiden Shogun won't be as useful as if you just bring the Raiden national team. So I wouldn't recommend building her in the early game. But if you do need a specialized support for Raiden Shogun in the late game, she is the one to use. Kokomi fits in less popular teams as of right now as a healer. The only meta team Kokomi fits is a variation of Permafreeze where you kick out Diona and use Kokomi as the healer, but you do lose the shielding part. Kokomi is solid right now as a healer, but she was pretty bad when she first came out. Again, she's an Inazuma character, so it's gonna be quite hard to build her. And the other thing with her is that, again, she doesn't slot into too many meta teams as of the moment. So she is going to be good enough to carry you through the early game, but her artifact set, the climb set, won't be unlockable until you get to Inazuma. So I wouldn't recommend building her right away as sort of a damage slash healer, so just use her as a healer, stack HP on her as for early game characters. But you can swap her into sort of a healer slash sub DPS or healer slash burst DPS once you get to Inazuma. Toma, I wouldn't recommend building at all. The only reason for Toma was the designated support for Hu Tao. But Hu Tao works much better in your Repress team with Xingqiu than with Toma in your Mono Pyro team. So Toma fell off the meta right after his release, so nobody's been talking about him since. Ito is actually very friendly for beginner characters because it's massive damage and easy to buildness. If you do not have Inazuma unlock yet, you can use the 4-piece I forgot, it's the 4-piece shield set on him. But the main problem with Ito right now is, as for late game, he works only well with mono geo teams, and mono geo teams are quite expensive to build. Basically, the same goes for Goro. Goro is the designated support for Ito. So Goro works well with Ito in the late game, but they are a very specialized team, and they don't do too well in most Spiral Beast situations. But as of this Spiral Beast, they're doing quite well. Shenhe is someone that fits into certain teams to buff Ayaka or any other character's damage. But Shenhe isn't too meta right now, and Shenhe is sort of hard to build because you just need to stack as much attack percent as possible. And Shenhe herself doesn't do too much damage, so I wouldn't recommend specifically going for Shenhe. But if you do have Shenhe, you can build her sort of as a damage buffer for your cryo characters. But she's again sort of an expensive 5-star version of Rosaria, so wouldn't recommend exactly pulling for her, but if you have her, you can build her for late game. Sorry, she's supposed to go in this tier. And Yunjin is used as the support for Ayato and Yoimiya. So again, not doing too well in the early game, but she's someone you can build after you get to late game. The other thing with Yunjin is Yunjin's Q can work with most characters because your main DPS will likely be doing normal attacks as sort of their main source of damage. So Yunjin works well with that in early game, but in terms of mid game, it's when Yunjin doesn't have a lot of room to use unless you already have Ayato and Yoimiya and using them together with Yunjin. Yae Miko highly do not recommend building. The main problem with Yae has quite a bit of problems. Energy recharge is the biggest problem, and also her damage isn't that too impressive, and the fact that she needs Raiden Shogun, and Shogun works better without her in terms of damage. So wouldn't recommend building Yae Miko too much, but if you want her, she is a sub DPS that does have few meta teams. She's a DPS that does have a few meta teams in the Spiral Beast as of right now. Similar case with Ayato to Yoimiya, they are both characters that focuses on specialized auto attacks to do damage, and Ayato is someone you can start building from day one. He's rather free to play friendly, and Ayato's damage is quite compared to Yoimiya, Ayato's damage is a little bit more better because they didn't nerf him as hard as Yoimiya in the beta testings. So he's someone that I would definitely recommend start building from day one. Yelan, her banner is, I believe, still on and about to go away in 2 days. Yelan is definitely someone I would recommend start building from day one. Her damage herself is very significant. She does most of her damage off field, which means you can support other people, and she is a Hydro character, which is rather rare, so all of these added together, and she's basically very meta right now. So that's basically I would recommend building her starting from day one. So that's my tier list. Please leave your comments down below whether you agree or disagree. As I've said, basically again, the characters that are in the same tier, I sort of agree that they're on the same power level. I'm not necessarily putting one above the other or below the other. Do let me know in the comments below whether you agree with this tier list or not. Thank you very much for watching and have a nice day.